Welcome, and thank you for choosing to spend the evening with us to hear more about this evening's dinner discussion on technology transformation in Shenzhen and in Hong Kong, leadership lessons from our 2019 Global Immersion course. This event is a collaboration between UCLA Anderson Center for Global Management, the Easton Technology Management Center, and the UCLA NUS Executive MBA program. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here this evening. I know we have a number of alumni, we have current students from our FEMBA and EMBA programs, and we also are happy to welcome students here, first-year students from our full-time MBA class of 2021, who only started a week or two ago, and of course both cohorts, the 2019 and 2020 classes of the UCLA NUS Executive MBA programs, who I had the privilege of talking to at lunchtime today to share more about the opportunities and the global immersion courses that will be available to you. And the UCLA NUS EMBA students also happen to travel to Shenzhen too as part of their residency. So I also had the pleasure of traveling with a few of you to Shenzhen and Hong Kong and accompanied the class in March, and that was really the impetus for this evening's discussion. So I'm Lucy Allard, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Global Management here at Anderson, which is really the center responsible for globalizing the student experience here at the school. And we're also the center that runs and manages the global immersion courses. And our mission at the CGM is really to connect our students and to train and equip them to become successful global leaders that can really operate in a global marketplace, really understand and appreciate different cultures and different ways of doing business, and can examine management, operational, and policy issues from a global perspective. And we do that from a variety of on-campus and off-campus academic and experiential courses and programming, and really our flagship course are the Global Immersion courses that you're here to learn more from, one of these outstanding courses this evening. And these courses have really been transforming students' lives, I believe, and really educating them on global issues since they originated, thanks to Professor Carla Hain over there when she was the Dean of the EMBA and FEMBA programs back in 2008. Now, they are 4-unit elective courses, and they really expose students to the economy, the political environment, the major industries, the major sectors, businesses in a particular country. As well, you learn about the key historical events and the culture in that particular country and the different ways of doing business. There's an on-campus component followed by a 1-week immersive week of company site visits, guest speakers. You hear from key business executives, policy leaders, government officials. You visit startup accelerators, and you really get to network with our alumni, both on the UCLA alumni community as well as the UCLA Anderson alumni community. So for anybody who's interested in them, please see me afterwards or shoot me an email. But it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to this evening's discussion. As I mentioned, it's really coming out of our first technology-focused global immersion course that took place in March of this year. And it was the first time we actually visited and did the combination of Shenzhen and Hong Kong, although it was actually the 7th time that we visited the mainland China and the 5th time that we visited Hong Kong. And our panelists this evening are technology-oriented students / alumni, Ryan to be an alum in a couple of days' time, who actually participated on the course and traveled with Professor Kramer and myself to Shenzhen and to Hong Kong. And they're really going to share insights and lessons learned from the 1 week in country, where they visited leading technology companies and really saw firsthand the technology transformation that is occurring in the region. And you'll also be able to participate in this evening's conversation as well. You'll see up here on the slide, we're using Slido, where you can put in your questions, see everybody's questions, vote them up. It's an audience interactive tool, and Professor Kramer will have that on his iPad, so he'll see the most popular questions. So that's a way for you to engage. But it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator of this discussion, Professor Terry Kramer, who was the professor who taught the course and truly led the course. And I have to say that this was the most applied to global immersion course in in history. And as a result of that, we will be repeating this particular course in March of next year. So Professor Kramer is a UCLA undergrad alum and a Harvard Business School MBA alum. He is an adjunct professor of technology management here at Anderson, and he is also the faculty director of the Easton Technology Management Center. He teaches, and many of you, I'm sure, if you had the opportunity, have had him teach you the Foundational Tech Management course, and he also teaches the Innovation and Evolution in the Global Mobile Industry course too. Save up all your points because they're very, very popular courses. He actually comes from industry, so he spent over 30 years in the telecommunications field. 18 of those 30 years were with Vodafone in a variety of both domestic and international roles. He was also appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as ambassador, head of the US delegation for the World Conference on International Telecommunications. And he also is the two-time recipient of the UCLA Anderson Teaching Award, Teacher of the Year Award in the Fully Employed MBA program. And if you've had the opportunity to take a class with him, to see him in action, and to really witness his passion for teaching, you'll know the reason why he's the recipient of that award. So please join me in welcoming Professor Terry Kramer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Lucy, thank you for a very kind introduction, and let me just start out in a big thank you for your interest in this topic. So I have to say this to me is one of the most interesting set of topics I think you're going to hear tonight, because this is going to be the intersection of technology and what's going on in the greater China region. And I don't need to lecture a lot of you about technology, but I do think it's important to look at the leadership issues that are coming out of technology. The number of new businesses, new services, value creation that are happening via technology is astounding. The number of companies, candidly, that are getting destroyed because they're established players not seeing new opportunities. The number of governments and societies that are able to deal with fundamental issues, whether it be in healthcare, whether it be in education, is just astounding. And coming out of Anderson, one of the most important things I think that we need to be able to do as leaders is look at that environment and have a point of view on a whole bunch of things that are oriented around leadership. Where's innovation going to happen next? Who are the players that are going to win? What do you need to do as leaders of companies to ensure you're going to be successful? How do you deal with a regulatory environment that is very different place to place to place? So a whole bunch of things going on with technology. We have the opportunity tonight to look at that in relation to the greater China region, where we're seeing some of the most profound innovation happening, the availability of data and new services. So let me just give you a little bit of context on the course so you'll understand the questions, the students that are going to be talking here. So as Lucy mentioned, this is a course that runs through the winter and spring, and there's basically three key elements of the course. Number one is a discussion, a case-based discussion that happens here on campus before we go travel in country. And we use three cases to discuss fundamental opportunities of companies based in China. So we look at Alibaba, we look at Tencent, and we look at Huawei. So covering all the different areas of technology, internet services, e-commerce, etc. The second thing is we go in country. And in country, there's a whole set of visits that we've made. There are three primary sectors we looked at to really do a deep dive and understand where innovation is. First one is internet services, so think of Tencent and related companies. Second one is high-tech manufacturing, so Huawei, with what they do with handsets, what they do with infrastructure, etc. And then the third area is Alibaba with e-commerce and all the things you can do with data for lending, etc. So there's a set of case discussions. We then go in country, and then the final visit that we do, the final time in class, is to ask the students, based on everything you've seen, what is the most promising area of innovation that hasn't been developed yet that you would recommend based on understanding the region, and why do you think that's so attractive? And again, this isn't quote-unquote a book report looking at something that's already happened. This is coming up with new things that are out there. So we'll talk about that. So on tonight, what we're going to do tonight is we'll do a series of questions with Ryan, with Richard, and Morgan is dialing in from Seattle, from Microsoft. We'll ask a variety of questions there. I'm then going to share my own observations very briefly about what I saw in market, leadership imperatives, etc., and then we'll go to questions. Last thought, just to leave you with, and again, as you know, I'm very big on this, it certainly is interesting to hear about promising products and services, but remember those products and services a year from now, 2 years, 3 years from now, will be all different likely. And what matters more is the ability to look at innovation over a period of time as a leader and develop a point of view and lead in that environment. So let's switch over now, and again, thank you for being here. Good, so I'd like to start out with each of our students and just have them briefly tell us about your background, academically, professionally, and why you signed up for the course. Ryan, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ryan. I got my bachelor's and master's degree on the East Coast, and I'm right now finishing up my executive MBA at UCLA, graduating in 4 days. I really joined the global immersion because I had some background working in China. Right now, I head up M&A for the second largest telco in Singapore. But I really want to take a step back, both academically, as well as take a deep dive into some of the areas that Professor Kramer talked about. So I saw that as an opportunity. I think the second reason why I participated was Professor Kramer is really big on contextual leadership. And a lot of leadership today is applied to different contexts and different cultures. So I felt that an immersive process would help in terms of helping me to understand myself, my strengths and weaknesses, and how to adapt to different environments in today's dynamic and complicated business environment.
Excellent, thank you. Richard?
Yes, so I was a mathematical economics major in college. So I came here, wanted to study global management and technology management. So to me, the decision to participate in this course was really a no-brainer. China is the second largest economy in the world and has probably the second most developed technology. So as a student of technology management and global management, I knew I kind of had to study technology in China. And then Professor Kramer teaching the class was kind of a cherry on top, and a pretty big one at that.
Thank you. Excellent. And Morgan, you want to share your thoughts? Again, Morgan is joining us via Zoom in Seattle at Microsoft.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person tonight. My name is Morgan Greenwald. I went to Northwestern University for my undergrad, where I studied film and economics. And from there, worked in the TV industry in LA before getting my MBA at UCLA and just graduating a month and a half ago. I currently work at Microsoft as a partner marketing advisor. And knowing that I was going to pursue a career in technology, and particularly at a large multinational company, knew that having an international business experience focused on technology was really going to be critical, not only to my immediate career after business school, but to my long-term growth as a leader. As a student who had taken courses with Professor Kramer before, I knew that this would be a really valuable experience in order to gain those leadership lessons.
Excellent, good. And Morgan, let me pose the first question to you. If you were to go back before you started the class to now, after you've gone, what were the things you thought you were going to see in market, and what were the things that you actually saw?
You know, one of the things that was really overwhelming to me was how rapid and overwhelming customer adoption of products were, particularly in the internet services space. You know, we had done our research and we had learned about all of these various apps that the Chinese were using quite frequently, but I did not realize how immersed that the Chinese population was into their app ecosystem. So much so that the super app ecosystem, as it's called, almost owns the end-to-end daily life of the consumer. And this was something that we certainly saw in market, as we actually were unable to often buy things whenever they wanted to grab a coffee in between meetings, because we're in the 10-cent WeChat Pay ecosystem. So I think that was something that really shocked and overwhelmed me, and really was a sign at truly how successful some of these companies have been at scaling their businesses.
Excellent. Richard?
Yes. So there are two things that really surprised me. First of all, when I was in Shenzhen, I was really amazed by how modern and how new the city feel. I was in Shenzhen for the first time probably like 15 years ago, and at the time it was very chaotic. The streets were dirty. There were not that many people around. And this time when I was in Shenzhen, I saw something completely different. The sky was punctured by skyscrapers. Traffic was very organized. People there was obeying the law. Streets were super clean. It did not feel like a city belonging to a developing country. It felt like a modern city, better than Seattle, better than Chicago, all of those modern cities. And the second thing was along those lines of what Morgan was saying, adoption of technology. I remember when I was in Shenzhen, I was going to a famous boba shop, and I was trying to pay, but that place would not accept cash, and they do not accept credit cards either. The only method of payment they would accept was mobile, and I could not even pay. Like I could not order boba tea because I could not pay, even though I had cash, which to me was really a shocker. And I think, Ryan, you were there too, right? Yeah. So I was like, yeah. I thought it was ridiculous. but that just really shows how far, how far technology has penetrated people's behavior. Everyone is on mobile now. It's a mobile-first country. So to me, that was quite a shocker.
I guess for me, two things really stood out. The first is the quality of the ecosystem, how well thought out it is. I realized that Shenzhen is located close to the manufacturing bases in China, so they can turn around parts very quickly and go to market quickly with their new products and innovation. Also, it's located next to Hong Kong and at the coastal area of China, so it's easy to, attract talent and get the products out to the greater world and the greater world market. The second was the quality of people. When we went to Tencent, we were briefed by someone, a graduate from MIT. She worked in the McKinsey office in the US, and she came back to Tencent. And she spoke perfect English and perfect Chinese. And we were surprised, and she said, the 20 of us in the strategy office in Tencent. And that really hammered home the quality of the people in China. They are educated, they're smart, and they're driven. And I knew there were, of course, people like that, but the quality and the quantity was amazing.
Yeah. Do you remember what her answer was? By the way, we asked, why did you go back to Shenzhen? Why didn't you stay and work at Google or Amazon? You remember what she said?
She wanted to return to the country.
Yeah.
She wanted to contribute back.
Yeah, it's where the action is.
Yeah.
She just kind of looked at us like, why wouldn't you? This is really where things are happening. So very interesting outcome. So if you get down now to specific examples of products and services that you were very impressed with, what would you highlight, right?
So if you look at Tencent and their WeChat, you'll see a lot of Chinese people, they could speak into the phone instead of typing things out. WeChat has actually launched a product called WeChat Work. And what it does is it intends to take all this data from all the voice commands that people use. They want to bring it to the enterprise. So think about approving leave. You don't need to log on to SAP. You just speak into your phone or speak in your computer, and the leave gets automatically approved. So that is a huge productivity gain, and it's a platform on top of existing products. So it's ability to disrupt and increase productivity and innovation.
Mm-hmm. Good. Richard?
Right, so I'm going to give an unsexy answer to that question. I was very excited to see what Foxconn was up to. Foxconn is such a huge part of China being the factory of the world. But over time, their advantages have really eroded because living standards have risen. Cost of labor is not as cheap anymore. They face a lot of competition from neighboring countries. So what is Foxconn going to do? So turns out, because they were so good at manufacturing, and they spent so much time, spent so much investment into building the infrastructure for supply chain, for producing and delivering their product. Now they figure out they can sell this kind of supply chain management services to other companies. So they developed this company and then spun it off. It's called Jusda, Jusda, and they provide supply chain management services to companies in China and in the world. So this is a huge case to me of using existing advantages in developing a new business to cope with the changing world. So to me, that was, first of all, a very interesting product because it shows, because this can offer a lot of value worldwide. And second, a great leadership lesson for how you sometimes really need to be flexible as a leader. and manage the company.
Let me add on to both of your comments before we go to Morgan, because we talk about transformations. Both of what Richard and Ryan have talked about to me have been transformations. So Foxconn, as quote unquote a manufacturer, is seeing that the world is shifting to a more data-oriented one, where there are opportunities in data, and they're shifting their model to making money in that area. It's a very clever way to say, I need to continue the growth path of my company, and this is where it's going. The thing that Ryan raised, it's transformational. We take it for granted people access the internet via texting and typing. There is a very early, strong move right now that's saying people are going to start interacting via voice. It completely changes the model of exchange of information. It changes the people that are competing. Players like Google aren't the ones I referenced. And those players have to think about how do they reposition themselves. So I just want to call out two examples of transformation that both of them are talking about. And Morgan, let's go over to you.
Yeah, so one of the innovations that I was most impressed by actually came from a startup called Squirrel AI. And Squirrel AI is an ed tech startup that focuses on improving students' performance in school. And I was really impressed by how different their approach was to say how students are tutored in the United States and in the West. So rather than focusing on what students do well and encouraging them to pursue what they do well, this app identifies all of the knowledge points on which students are performing poorly and has them improve in those areas. And to me, this is a great use of China's availability of mass amounts of data. And secondly, a really interesting approach to elevate not just their current years of students, but their future workforce, and in a way that may make them more competitive than other countries.
Excellent. Excellent. Good. So now let's talk more about global context and context specifically in China, in Shenzhen specifically, in Hong Kong, et cetera. And just say a little bit about that context. What made the technology innovation that you saw there unique in that region? Ryan?
Well, I think in China, the reason at least I realized, the reason why technology propagates so fast or adoption is so fast is because their view of privacy is fundamentally different from that in the Western world, in like Singapore or the US, right? They don't view privacy as a key, I would say, right? They are more open to sharing data about themselves, not only at a personal level, but also across applications. So this enables rapid adoption and rapid information sharing across platforms. So you have Tencent, you have Alibaba, you have Huawei. All these companies build a view of the Chinese consumer over time. And to Professor Kramer's point, leveraging AI and leveraging data analytics, what this allows them to do is form a better view of the consumers at the individual level, the regional, and the country level. And that allows them to push out products and services quickly. So that to me was a key difference.
Yep. Excellent. Richard?
So I have one thing to say about China and one thing to say about Hong Kong. So in China, to add on to what Ryan was saying, one huge thing about the Chinese market that is so different from others is the level of customer, the speed of customer adoption that enables technology, right? The second huge enabler of technology development in China is the role of the government. So a lot of us here know the Chinese government has these 5-year plans. So included in these 5-year plans over time were development of 5G technology, the use of AI, getting everyone to be on mobile. So the big companies in China, the BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, all played into these government strategies, and they actually got a lot of support from the government too, so that they could achieve the scale. These are all massive companies that are playing a huge role in everyone's life in China. And on the Hong Kong side, so Hong Kong is kind of in a tough spot because they have such a small population. So doing B2C is kind of out of the question for them. So they had to think about what are their competitive advantages. Well, they have a lot of banks, and they're known as a financial center of the world. So what is the natural move to do here? And that to them, well, is fintech. So fintech, because B2B is going to be huge. We're not talking about B2C fintech, we're talking about B2B. So servicing banks, servicing financial institutions around the world is a good move. And the second thing is because the laws in Hong Kong are geared towards international law. So privacy laws are well protected. When other countries look at where a company is from, they know this from Hong Kong. They know that the company respects privacy. They respect copyright and everything. So they trust that more. So there are a lot of fintech companies that are based in Hong Kong. Somebody said, well, in one of the discussions that we had in Hong Kong, somebody said that 6 years ago there was basically no fintech in Hong Kong, but ever since, this has really mushrooming in Hong Kong. And I think this is another huge example of making contextual decisions in driving the business forward.
Good, thank you. Morgan?
You know, jumping onto something that Ryan noted about the role of government in helping scale these companies, one of the things we also really noticed is that government, while it has helped companies like Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent really grow and squeeze out smaller competitors in China, is that the government has also curbed their ability to expand internationally. So I think in looking at how China continues to be a player in the global economy, it will be really important to see how the other major and small players in the global economy perceive China, as that's going to have a massive impact on these companies' ability to expand globally.
Yeah, good point. Let me now go a step further now to say where are winners, and we don't call them losers, but where are the winners going to come from geographically? And I want to give you a couple of data points and have you answer it. Our last visit that we had in Hong Kong was a woman that heads up the Asia FinTech Association. She's from India originally, lived there for 20, 30 years, and then has been in Hong Kong for another 20, 30 years. And I asked her, and it's one data point, so I'll give you that, but I said, tell me by region of the world where you think the greatest innovation is going to happen. And let me give you the rank order because I'm going to ask you guys your own view on this. Number 1 was China. Number 2 was the US. Number 3 was India. Number 4 was Europe. So first of all, India, by the way, was not ranked highly in that, which is an interesting discussion in and of itself. Let me give you a second data point. McKinsey has done a lot of work recently, the Global Institute, about superstar nations. Superstar nations, superstar companies, superstar individuals. And a lot of that has to do with there are certain companies, geographies, et cetera, that in this kind of scale-based internet world are more likely to succeed than others. Number 1, you need scale, because a lot of these plays are data-oriented, so you need a lot of scale there. You need technical skills to win in those environments, and you need the availability of talent. So let me start with you as a very unfair question, being from Singapore. Ryan, first of all, where do you come out? The population of Singapore is 7, 8 million?
5.
5 million, sorry. Thank God I erred on the high side. Where are smaller nations going to come out on this? Do you worry about that? And then I'm going to ask the others the same question.
I think that's a really good question. I think as Professor Kramer said, the scale of the market really matters, both in terms of scaling innovation, scaling products. I think the challenge for small nations like Singapore is we don't have a great hinterland. We don't have a great hinterland of consumers, and the population is just not big enough. So in China, for example, or the US, if you have 0.1% of the population as successful entrepreneurs, absolutely, that's a large number. Whereas in a small country like Singapore, I think the challenge is that this number is small, and they don't have a lot of incentives. Singapore has tried to push innovation through the government. But I would argue that the success of that has been quite limited. In China and in the US, my view is there's a good relation between the government and the private sector, and incentives are more aligned between the private sector and innovation. In Singapore, there's a lot of money going into innovation, but honestly, I think the ROI of the output so far is not as, of course, as large as in a large market like China, India, or the US. So that's my view.
Excellent, very helpful. Richard?
Right. So let me talk about the US. Well, the US has a pretty sizable population. It's not like 1.4 billion like China, but we have like 300 million people, which is a lot of people. But the disadvantage is, actually, it's going to sound ironic, is that there's a lot of competition. So there's like perfect competition basically. So economists would love this, but for the sake of technology development, it basically is a deterrent, because, well, just let's take 5G infrastructure for example. Like Verizon wants to develop their own infrastructure, AT&T wants to develop their own, other companies want to develop their own. In China, the government wants to push 5G infrastructure to the rest of to the entire country. So they are able to achieve this kind of massive scale. And from that, they allow other corporations in the country to develop 5G technology. And we see this not only in 5G, also in AI development, in possibly voice assistant, and a lot of things that are included in China's 5-year plans. So given that, I think we are at a bit of a disadvantage here. Our academic research is top-notch, but China is making up for that by actually partnering with our academic institutions, with MIT, with Carnegie Mellon, with all the top researchers in the world. So in the long run, I think if the situation remains the same like this, eventually China may beat out the US. I actually had an argument on this with Professor Kramer. I was arguing for the other side, and then after being in China, I changed my mind, and I'm hoping that someone else can change my mind back later.
Good. Morgan, I'm going to expand the question even further for you, lucky you. On one side, Kai-Fu Lee, who's a former head of Google in China, has basically said that China, he said in a very polite way, but in a recent interview said China's eclipsing the US on AI, on data, et cetera, et cetera. He also said the loss of jobs is going to be huge all over the world on AI. So let me put that out as one data point. The second one on the opposite side is Europe. Europe leading GDPR, saying you better be careful about all this data. You're going to have a really big problem if you're not careful. Antitrust related issues with US companies. Put those two data points on top of all of it. Give us your view about the US in relation to all the other regions.
So I think the US is in a really interesting perspective when it comes to how we approach data. I think US consumers don't love that massive corporations have access to their data, but we're okay with it as long as it makes our lives a little bit more convenient. So I think in terms of where we sit between, say, China and Europe, we are in an okay place in that our views towards privacy are not going to inhibit us. However, massive US corporations do have to respect the privacy rules all across the world. So how this may impact our innovation globally, that might be something to look at moving forward.
Excellent. Rich, I'm going to come back to you one more time now on your view on the US. If you're advising political leaders here, business leaders here, et cetera, what does the US need to do to maintain a good position? Right. These are all cold calls, by the way, unscripted, so I give them extra credit for answering these.
I love this.
Yeah.
I get an A+?
Yeah, so get an A+, even though the class is over.
Okay. So I think the biggest trend here in technology development, both in the US and China, but this is one area where the US could do a lot better, is forming partnerships. So we were talking about like Verizon and AT&T both trying to develop their 5G infrastructure. What if these two companies actually shake hands and jointly develop this kind of infrastructure? They don't even have to do it alone. They could also partner with other companies that would be able to put their money in and all benefit from this development of infrastructure and of reaching the scale enough to make things cheap and make things accessible to everybody. And I think as our discussion goes on, we will also see other aspects of partnerships, even the companies in China, right? Ryan was referring to our discussion with one of Tencent's young leaders, and she actually stressed the role of partnerships a lot. We're talking about how the WeChat platform allows it to do everything, but WeChat doesn't provide all these 1,000 things on their platforms. Instead, they partner with hundreds of other providers in China to develop these kind of services to Chinese consumers, and that is something that I think that US companies can do. Of course, there are two huge advantages in this. First of all, access to consumers, and second, develop the infrastructure, develop the prerequisites for further technological advancement in the country.
Just something to add to that. I think if I was advising the US, I would say send more of your young talent to China to study, to immerse themselves in the culture, to understand the country. Not only in terms of academics, but also working there. We met entrepreneurs who just moved from the US to China. We asked him why, what are you doing this? And he said, I just want to come here and study the market. I want to study the Chinese culture. I think immersing yourself in that kind of environment puts the US, and Singapore does that too, in a better position to groom young leaders, young international leaders such as yourselves, to really operate effectively in a truly international business environment. I think that's really important.
Yep.
Just one more anecdote about the Chinese market. When we talk to Huawei, and of course there's some trade issues right now that they are impacting the business, and we asked them, are you worried? And they told us they're not, and we asked them why. 35% of the world's base stations are in China. Think about that. 35%. And to them, it's okay. If half of their other markets don't want to do business, that's fine, because they still have the domestic market to rely on. So that illustrates the power of scale and the power of size.
Yep. Let me add on another question related to that, Ryan, and that's about culture. So part of it is if you have people from the US, from Anderson and others, go abroad and go to China, what cultural advice would you give them? And if you want to, wade into, is there a disadvantage? Do Americans, highly individualistic, et cetera, is there actually a cultural disadvantage for Americans going and succeeding abroad?
It's an interesting question. That's a cold call, by the way.
Yeah.
Singapore is a unique country. We're half, I would say half Western and half Eastern, right? So we have Confucian values, we understand the Chinese context, but obviously we're quite Western in some senses. I would say if you go to China to operate, the first thing is to listen and to observe. So you seek to, I would say, understand first, rather than to be understood. I think that was what the entrepreneurs in country said or singled out as the most important quality going in. Observe and listen. Because so much is happening around you, you may not catch the nuances of all of it. And if you don't pay attention, you might miss important facts or important aspects of the context. Mm-hmm. That's the first advice I would give. I think the second thing is to study the language. It sounds trivial, but the language, the Chinese language, Mandarin, is very different from English. And there are a lot of nuances and historical, cultural contexts that you might miss out if you don't speak the language. That's what I think.
Excellent. Excellent. Good. Morgan, let me go to you now, and I want to ask a final question before I share a couple observations and then go to what are a lot of audience questions that have come in. Morgan, your own leadership learnings, as you kind of think about, obviously, the course, the visits in country, reflections, what were your own leadership learnings?
I think one of the greatest things that I learned was actually said to us by one of the speakers we had in Hong Kong, this investment banker who worked in TMT. And she had made this statement that users are ultimately the most important thing. And especially after seeing how businesses operate in China, how consumers operate in China, I could not agree with her more. I think we really need to look as a country and see how are we cultivating usership and how are we growing that usership, because ultimately whoever has the most users, whether that be a specific company or a specific country, is going to be the winner.
Excellent. Richard?
So I'd like to take away two things from the meeting that we had with the UCLA alumni in Hong Kong. So one of them said, you have to take risk. As I mentioned before, 6 years ago in Hong Kong, there was no fintech. So if you came in at that time, you got all the resources available to you. Okay? You got all the talent. That was an exciting time. 20 years ago, there was basically no technology in China. So the companies that started out, all the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent started about the same time. If you took a risk at the time, you are successful. And then the second thing is, you have to do your research first. Really understand the context of the country, the business you're trying to get into, and once you find the answer to your questions, you have to be convicted. You have to be really determined to follow your path. To quote their exact saying, 1,000% conviction. Mm-hmm. In China, the people there are hungry. They are willing to outwork you. They are willing to out-innovate you. They do everything to succeed. So if you want to be successful, you have to go all in. And that is actually something that I learned from Professor Kramer in one of his other classes too. So if you're still at Anderson, try to take it.
Good. Excellent, Ryan?
I think for me, a big takeaway was humility and drive. And I'd like to link this to an in-country example. We met a Chinese entrepreneur, right? The person that Morgan mentioned started up Squirrel AI. And he shared a personal anecdote. So when he was an undergraduate, he was given the choice of majors. And he said there are 20 subjects. So if you're a normal person like me, or maybe Richard, you would talk to 20 different people with 20 different majors, and then make a decision from there. This guy, he went to a library. He read the textbooks of each of the 20 subjects cover to cover. And by himself, he chose that major. And he said it was normal. He just spent maybe a month or so in the library. And the point here is, if you think you're driven and you're talented, and all of us are here in the room for a reason, there are thousands of people in China who are more driven and more motivated than you. So after that, I stopped complaining about work and the amount of classwork that Professor Kramer gave us. But I guess the point is, as future leaders, we also need to be humble, and we need to maintain that sense of drive. So.
Yeah. By the way, that message is almost verbatim what Jitu Patel, he's the Chief Product and Strategy Officer at Box, who spoke in my class a couple of months ago, almost verbatim what he said. You've got to be smart and you've got to be driven. And same thing, if you think that you're just going to be smart and win in the world, you are wrong. There's a lot of other talented people there. So listen, let me share a couple of my observations, and then I want to go to your questions, and then we'll pose a final question to the audience. So let's put the slides up there. And the first slide is my own observation on the trip. And I think you'll find a lot of it is what Morgan and Ryan and Richard said. And I just want to call these out. The first one is the topic and the exogenous issue about the number of people that have been lifted out of poverty is amazing. The stat is something like 95% of the population in China have been lifted out of poverty in the last 20, 30 years. And I want to just call out for a quick second, Christine Lowe is one of our visiting professors here. She speaks in my class. It was a very interesting dialogue. You always kind of think of speakers and what do you remember? And there was a little bit of a discussion about commercial advances and political issues and the like. And she says you have to remember the number of people that are seeing prosperity, that have given them new opportunities, that have allowed them to say, I'm going to try products and services out, and I'm going to cut some slack with my elected leaders, the government leaders, et cetera, is staggering. So I just wanted to call that out because that is a contextual item that is necessary for growth of a lot of these products and services. You need to have affluence, you need to have willingness to adopt, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing I want to call out is leapfrog innovation. We tend to think, I grew up in the mobile industry, and I'm looking at Craig Ehrlich, who's the former head of the GSMA. We tend to think in the US we do great things, and we have. We've done wonderful things, but we think we're net exporters of all the great things in the world. And it is humbling to realize that that is not always the case. And so the leapfrog innovation, and we talked about mobile payments, 5G we'll get into, but China is dramatically outpacing the US on 5G deployments by roughly 5-to-1 base stations in terms of what's out in the marketplace. Amazing leapfrog activities going on. Third observation I had of all the visits that we did in country, it was amazing. Very few of the companies that we visited talked about international expansion. Implicit in what they talked about is a very, very large domestic market. And that domestic market is both consumer and enterprise. And what was interesting in visiting these companies is you go to a company like Tencent that we think of as consumer, they're doing a bunch of things on enterprise. They're doing stuff that IBM is doing with IBM Watson, diagnostic capabilities in healthcare, et cetera. And the message here is the market seems to be so large that the focus about expanding and going to the US and all that is kind of a secondary piece. Fourth item. All the references to government were fundamentally different than the references to government here. The references to government that we heard were much more fundamental in nature. This is the policy, this is the measures of success, these are the resources, these are the companies, and full steam ahead. Having worked in the State Department, that fundamentally is not how the US works. The US has government will give out ideas, and at the end of the day, industry's got to decide it's going to want to take it on. It's a very different model. And so in the areas that matter a lot, healthcare, education, et cetera, this stuff, you get a sense that things are moving along. And it's not, again, theoretical, but it's very much policy driven. Next item on this was the role of data. I'm going to talk to you in a second about the team projects the students did. Almost every single one of these were data-oriented projects. They weren't manufacturing-oriented. They were very much data-oriented. And the role of data, the ability to access the data and use it, was fundamental in everything that's happening. And then the willingness to try, to say, hey, listen, things have been pretty good. I want to try. And again, I want to list the last point here because I think it's something so important for all leaders to think about. We love what we do, but we better look at the rest of the world. And our job is to pick the best ideas anywhere and then figure out what you import and what you export. But it's humbling to know we're not leading in everything. And that's fine, but the job, again, of leaders is to be able to pick these things out. So let me go to the next slide. And this slide is on the team projects. So the team projects, as you remember, all the students had to come back after their visits and think about the most promising area of innovation that they would advocate. And let me give you some of the projects they came up with. They had a pocket financial advisor, so basically an AI-based financial advisor was one. WeChat Work, which is kind of like a Slack type of a solution. Autonomous drone delivery for e-commerce applications. Another one was a personal shopper, again with AI understanding what people want and where they're going to go. A wealth management tool, so like a robo-advisor, but a wealth management tool, and a smart farming tool. Now, what I do on team projects at the end of every term is I ask myself the so whats. Are there common themes to what we're hearing? And in turn, with this class, I compared my tech management class, which is mostly a US-oriented class, and I compared it to this class. And I asked myself, how is this class coming up with ideas that are different? And again, it's only one data point, a class of 40 against a class of about 60 or so, but I found it very, very interesting. So the first one is almost all of the innovations they talked about were driven from large companies. They were extensions from large companies. They weren't necessarily entrepreneurial ventures, which my US tech management class is more oriented around. A second one is almost everybody focused on the Chinese market. We gave them a prompt. You can come up with a product that you want to export into the US, neighboring economies, and go into Singapore and go anywhere you want. What would you do? Every single team said China is the market that we want. It says a lot about the size of market, et cetera. Third item, the role of government. Every single team had very explicit references to the role of government, good and bad. What the government wants and what's aligned, where you got to be careful running afoul. Almost none of my tech management students will reference government. There may be indirect things to HIPAA or something on healthcare, but it's random stuff. It's not fundamental stuff. Advanced forms of technology. If you look at that list I just gave you and actually compared it even to the US ones, it's just as advanced and probably more advanced because data is not the limiter. And so you have these super AI-oriented applications that are predictive in nature. For good or for bad, Hong Kong was not referenced in any of the projects. It's an interesting commentary about scale of market. You should still stay in Singapore. Great. There's still a lot of opportunities everywhere, but it was all about China. It's all about China and the size of the market. And the final one, which was common with tech management, is the future of work. When you look at the extrapolation of these cases that are put forward, the business cases with them, they're almost all job killers. They're basically saying to a company, you can get rid of this manual process and do these other things. And certainly, we live in an environment, you've got to reward entrepreneurship, but there's a looming societal issue that's going to come up everywhere, including China. Kai-Fu Lee referenced it there as well, that we're all going to have to reconcile. So those are a bit of the observations on the team project. Let me shift over to your questions that I've got here. I said I was not going to get into much on politics, but I'm going to, given there's so many votes, I'm going to let you guys try and answer this question. So how do you see the current political environment in Hong Kong impacting technological innovation? Could certain governmental responses cause companies to pull out? Be careful what you say. Please don't take sides, but do, as a third party, give us your view. Who wants to start? Are you okay, Richard?
Yes, that is such a deep question.
Okay. You want like a 30 seconds to reflect? That's all you're going to have.
Right. So I think the silver lining to this is that the Hong Kong people have shown that they want to keep their own system. So in our discussions on China and Hong Kong, there was fear that Hong Kong is going to be completely absorbed into China, and so it's going to lose all the advantages that it has. And for now, that is the presence of banks and also the data privacy and international laws. So with what's going on in Hong Kong right now, we know that the fusion of Hong Kong laws with mainland Chinese laws is probably not going to happen anytime soon. So I think what is going to come out of this is people are going to respect more Hong Kong's relative independence, its own identity, and its own legal system. So this may actually help out Hong Kong in the long run with their fintech play, because as they are trying to service international banks, international financial institutions in general, where reputation and respect for the law plays such a huge role here.
Excellent. Good. Thanks, Richard. Morgan?
I think Richard makes an excellent point. I think, however, the one thing we are going to have to watch is how this current instability impacts Hong Kong's financial business. If the business slows down because of all of this, companies like Alibaba and Tencent, which are already moving into the payments and wealth management space, could perhaps leapfrog Hong Kong's financial institutions in some ways. So if these issues become larger, I think Hong Kong could be in trouble.
Morgan, let me stay with you on that, because one of the other very popular questions asked is about upcoming innovations and trends in digital payments. And they say, what can the US market learn from China? So kind of in the spirit of contextual leadership, what are the things you'd say that have happened in China that the US can and should adopt? And where do you say, you know what, the context is different, it's not going to play out that way?
I think an important piece of context here to note is that credit cards never really took off in China. In China, there's always been this level of distrust towards traditional banking systems. And for that, most Chinese were unbanked before the rise of these big fintech players. So I think in our country, there would have to be a significant push to shift from credit cards to mobile payment. And I think for that to happen, you have to see mobile payments providers like, say, Apple or even Venmo really increase incentives for users to use them rather than using their credit cards. So perhaps increased loyalty programs, increased ease of use, other sorts of incentives that they might be able to provide that the credit card providers could not, or else I don't really see us switching from credit cards.
Yep. Excellent. Let me ask, do you guys have an add-on, or you want me to go to the next one? Okay. So the next question was, where do you think automation will be more disruptive, China or US, regarding job displacement? And what role do you think government and companies should take? Richard?
Sure, I'll take this one. So earlier on in the class with Professor Kramer, also going along the AI debate, so I have this concern. So it is obvious that as a whole, the Chinese population is not as well educated as the US US population. So what's going to happen when AI is going to displace workers? It's going to be a lot more difficult to train Chinese people to do things that are related to high tech. So I think that is a difficult question to answer, but that is something that the Chinese government has to figure out. They have 1.4 billion people. Even like 10% of the people who get unemployed is like 100 million people, and it will be very challenging for them to find alternative jobs for these people. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing about China, though, is that their government shapes where the country is going. It's not like in the U.S. So I think they have a plan. This is speculative, of course. Mm-hmm. They are still investing so heavily in AI, and I think they're smart enough to know the positive and negative consequences of AI development. So they probably have a plan, and whatever plan they have, they will be able to roll out nationwide. in the US, we don't have that. We are still debating a universal basic income, and they're both sides of the argument. There are a lot of issues here that are still under debate. In China, it will be like either yes or no. The government likes it, so everyone rolls with it. The government doesn't like it, so it's dead. So with that, I think China has a lot more tools in solving this potential issue in the future. I don't know what the particular solution is yet, but they will probably be observing how other countries do it, maybe learn something from the US, and then once they determine that this is the way to go, maybe shifting more people into like direct human contact kind of services, they will be saying to everyone in the country, all right, so this is what we're going to do, and then in 5 years we'll be achieving it. So on this front, I am a lot more bullish on China than on the US.
Good. Ryan?
Actually, you'd be surprised. I think that if you go to a big Chinese city, the coastal cities, it's like any other US city. People are educated, the city's developed. I think automation will hit these kind of cities and the US similarly. China is actually ahead of the US in many ways. I think the key difference here is, as I mentioned, in the Shenzhen Bay Area, which we visited, a key advantage was there will be innovation in Shenzhen, and the manufacturing center will be half an hour away. So the turnaround in terms of the go-to-market and the product manufacturing was really quick. I think in the US, though, I don't know where the major manufacturing centers are, but I assume a lot of products are still made in China. So China has that advantage, and if it can pivot its population and harness its drive, I think the future is really bright there. I think the key takeaway for us, or at least for me, is that we need leaders that can adapt to both environments. And if you can do that successfully, understand the context and adapt your style to the different challenges in each country, I think we're well placed to take advantage of that.
Excellent. Let me ask one last question from the audience, and then I'm going to pose one last question to you, and then we'll call it a wrap here. Question is, what are the biggest risks to a U.S. entrepreneur doing business in China? Or if you broaden the question, how do any U.S. Entity successfully do business in China?
I think a couple of factors. First, I think you need to understand, as Morgan and Richard have said, the role of the government. And the government here is not a single entity, but it happens at many levels. There's the country level, and there's the provincial level, and then, of course, the city level. Navigating each of these different layers is tricky. It's resource and time intensive. So you really have to do that to understand how different strategies and different tactics can adapt and can succeed in different cities. I think that's one. I think the second, as I said, you need leaders who can adapt to the Chinese consumer, the Chinese mindset. Just an anecdotal example. When we went to Tencent, a big topic that we discussed was the cultural differences. And this lady who was educated, as I said, at MIT, worked in McKinsey, US, she came back. She said the biggest change was that there was a blurring of lines between work and her personal life. At work, they would ask her things that people in the US would never ask, how old are your kids? What do you do at home? What do you do past 8 o'clock? And at first she would be uneasy, but she would warm up to it, she would give examples, and people would message her on a personal WhatsApp about work at like 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. It was perfectly acceptable. So you need people who can adapt to those kind of different contexts and different environments. I think that's very important.
So I think as a U.S. entrepreneur in China, you have to figure out a different path from most. Well, you definitely need to have your competitive advantage. Otherwise, you are going to be outworked by the Chinese people. The Chinese people, okay, they're hungrier, they work harder than you, they know people, they understand the way their people think. So that is an advantage for them. So what would be our advantages? Our advantages is our connections, our Western way of thinking. So I was observing the entrepreneurs that we got to meet in Shenzhen, and I realized that all of them were doing these two things. First of all, they understand government policies, they understand the trends in technology that are happening, and then they try to go along those trends. For example, they were providing infrastructure for AI. They were providing a way to easily convert from DC to AC for IoT smart home devices. They were doing healthcare and AI because the Chinese government is really encouraging this use. And the second thing is actually a company. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with this, DJI, which actually is a Chinese company, but when we were there, we were greeted by all foreigners, by US people, by UK people, by South Africans. So these are really foreign entrepreneurs trying to make it in China, and they were actually selling most of their products to the Western world instead of selling to the Chinese market. So if you want to set up a successful business in China, you have to find your own niche based on your personal connections, your personal experience, based on where you have the advantages that the Chinese people do not have. Don't just go there and thinking, oh, I'm just like one of them, and then you don't have a clear value proposition, and you may not last very long.
Excellent, good insights. Morgan?
One thing I would add, and we've spoken a lot about the importance of government today, but it's also incredibly important as an entrepreneur in China to gain the buy-in of the massive Chinese corporations. One entrepreneur we met with who was very successful in starting up a cross-border remittances payments company called EMQ was that successful because he was able to gain investment from Tencent and Alibaba. And I think as a second step, he had a really focused business model. I think if you enter China as an entrepreneur and you try to scale too quickly when companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Foxconn, Baidu can easily squeeze you out, you are going to be in trouble. But if you find your niche that you can succeed in and get these companies to support you, you can be successful.
Yep.
I think it's so critical today to be aware of what's going on in global business. If you operate within a silo, even if your company or your role may be restricted to one region, you are going to miss out on key innovations, key trends that are happening in the world. You must constantly be absorbing news, speaking to people from other regions, really learning about what's going on across the world in order to be a leader in your respective field.
I think for me, again, a big part of leadership is to listen and to be humble. I remember one of the entrepreneurs, when he said he went to China, he said he turned off his output device on his personal port, and he was referring to himself as a computer. And he just said he just turned on the input. So I think as leaders, we don't want to be an output device only. We also want to have, take in inputs and listen. And I think being humble and understanding different people and the context, especially in China, that's a big part of that. So as leaders of tomorrow's business environments, if we're humble and we listen and we seek to understand first rather than be understood, I think we're in a good place.
Excellent. Good. Let me share just a few thank yous just in closing here. So first of all, I want to just acknowledge again and thank Craig Ehrlich, Christine Lowe. Craig is the chairman of the Center for Global Management here. He's been a huge supporter of UCLA. He's a fellow Bruin, so thank you very much. Second is I wanted to thank Professor Lowe. Christine Lowe, as I mentioned, has spoken in my class. She covers this whole idea about non-market risks. It is such an important concept and candidly not an intuitive one kind of easily in US business. and so important. So Christine, thank you for being here. Third, I want to thank both Lucy and I want to thank Heather. So Lucy heads up the Center for Global Management. Heather heads up the Easton Center. I want to share a little my own personal insights. I just met with our new dean a week ago, Tony Bernardo. And I said to him, hopefully all of you as leaders are also thinking about your future roadmap and where innovation is going to happen, et cetera. I said to me, there's 2 areas in terms of our technology curriculum I'd like to see us do more work on, whether it's in coursework or conferences, et cetera. One is in international. This tonight, what you're seeing is the reason why we need to upweight our content on what's going on outside the US, because we'll get blindsided by stuff thinking everything is just fine. The second thing is technology and society, because there's a clear upside of what technology can do in a bunch of areas and a bunch of downside and issues of workforce and other things. And all of us as leaders are going to have to reconcile that, or we all will become bad people as technology advances. So I'd like to just thank Lucy and Heather for their ongoing work here. Finally, I just want to thank all of you for being here. There's a bunch of familiar faces. I want to also thank Morgan, Richard, and Ryan for paying back their own experience, helping us learn and grow our own leadership journey, being candid, being thoughtful in your answers. A big thank you.